Hi everyone. So I wasn't originally going to do this video, but a few people have reached out to me and asked me to share it. So here it is. So basically, this is a talk that I gave at work a few weeks ago for Pride Month, discussing my experience of coming out, of being diagnosed with HIV, and of what Pride means to me. So I'd like to take you on a journey with me over the past 26 years of my life, but I'm going to condense it down into around 30 or so minutes. We're going to start back in 1995 when I was 9 years old. I grew up in a tiny village south of the Lake District in the northwest of England. The local area was generally quite small-minded, quite homogenous, and there was very little diversity. I remember thinking about men very differently to how I did about women. I was attracted to men, but I knew I should have had the same feeling towards women. I knew that I should have been attracted towards women. And I guess I had a bit of a moment of revelation when I used to flick through my mum's clothing catalogues, and I remember spending far too much time in the men's underwear section than I probably should have. I remember at one point I even carefully and precisely cut out pages from the men's section and I hid them in my room. And I knew at that stage that what I was thinking, what I was feeling wasn't accepted, it wasn't normal. It really felt like there was something wrong with me. My mum eventually discovered that some of these pages were missing from the catalogue, and she wasn't really too happy with it. And I was far too scared at that point to own up to what I'd done. Even to this day, I've still not told my mum that that was me, but I think by now she's probably worked it out. There were homophobic jokes flying around school. My friends, my family, and even I would see homosexuality on TV or in the news, and we would react negatively. And the thing is, that attitude and that response was just so normal. It was expected almost. But all I wanted to be was straight. And I couldn't change that, no matter how hard I tried. And believe me, over the years I really did try. My internalised homophobia was rife. I grew up hiding my true self, trying to blend into the background, pretending to be interested in girls. I even had two girlfriends in school. And it was really hard work to try and keep up that illusion. But eventually, and sadly, it became second nature to me. A close friend of mine came out in our final year of school, and he was met with some really horrible reactions. He eventually moved to a different school because of it, and he tried to take his own life thanks in part to the ignorance, small-mindedness and the outright discrimination that he was facing daily. I wished that I had his courage and that I was ready to come out, but seeing the reaction, watching everything that happened before my eyes, I knew that I just couldn't do it, and I settled into thinking that I never would, and I'd hide this until I died. I finished school, I went through college, through uni, and then into work, and all the while I was still hiding my true self. Even though attitudes were changing, I knew other gay men and women in uni, and I could see them, living their lives to the fullest. I'd never felt comfortable enough to make that leap, and I stigmatised my sexuality so much that I truly believed I could change it. Through the years, I was having more and more thoughts about my sexuality, about the people I was attracted to, and the strength of that side was growing so quickly, and especially in the year following the end of my degree. When my degree finished, I moved back home to live with my parents for a little while, and I left uni with this plan in my head. And the plan was that I would go home, I would settle down, I would tackle and stop the gay thoughts in my head, I would stop being attracted to men, I'd find a girlfriend, and I'd then just live happily ever after. Clearly, that didn't work. Me standing here talking to you today is evidence of that. So at the age of 24, I'd been living back at my parents for around a year. And one evening I was sitting in the pub that I worked in. I was waiting to meet a friend. My shift had ended, and quite unexpectedly, a guy who'd been in the pub and I'd been serving all day came up to me and started chatting away. And I didn't think too much into it. Customers had always kind of struck up conversations with me, and it was just a completely normal thing. But it turns out on this occasion that it wasn't. This guy was flirting with me. We ended up swapping numbers that night, and it was a huge deal for me. It was like my first step. My thoughts were really erratic and chaotic, and it was like I was in panic mode. In that one evening, all of the work, time and effort that I'd spent fighting my thoughts had failed. My authentic side had won, and the war was over. On that very same night, I told a close friend that I was bisexual. Of course, I was hiding the fact that I was actually gay. I still couldn't admit that, not even to myself. But the thrill and the excitement of saying out loud was breathtaking, but so scary at the same time. That friend of mine supported me a huge amount and worked with me to plan my eventual coming out and finally taking that last step to become my whole self. And I was gradually telling my friends, conversations were happening at work, in parks, and most interestingly for me, I came out to two really good friends on top of a snow-covered mountain in the Lake District. But the small town that I worked in and that I lived close to loved gossip. In fact, people knew about my sexuality before I'd really started being open with it. And in a way, this was it was kind of forcing my hand. You know, I knew it wouldn't be long until these rumours reached my family. It's that kind of place where everyone knows everyone and they all know your business. Most of my friends were really supportive. There were a couple who were quite shocked and ended up treating me slightly differently to how they had in the past, albeit temporarily. Some friends didn't believe me, and some weren't even surprised at all. In the pub that I worked at, the news spread like wildfire. The backwards, small-minded, bigoted side of people was beginning to show. I'd heard a few comments like, "It's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve," from some of the regulars in the pub, and it was devastating to hear that. But sadly, I expected it. But by this point, the ball was rolling, and it was rolling fast. I just had to keep going because my family were next. I told my brother, and he was great, really supportive and understanding, and we talked about telling my mum and dad. I planned the whole thing out in my head over the next week or so, and I was so scared. But not because my parents are scary people, but they're the people that I love most and respect most in the world, and how would they view me and how would they treat me as a gay man? See, we weren't taught in school that it's okay or accepted to be gay. We weren't told about looking after our mental health. There was absolutely no inclusive relationship education, so all we had was rumours and jokes in the playground, and we had like the smallest snippet of sex education. So the big day came. I couldn't think properly. I can't describe just how nervous I was. My plan was to tell my parents before I went to work, and probably so I wouldn't have to deal with the potential reaction from them. I spent all day trying to just act normal while inside I was screaming. I was due to start work at around 5 p.m. and that time was coming really quickly. I kept pushing it off, putting it back, pushing back the time, but eventually I found the courage. So a little before 5, I went to where my parents were in this garden, and my whole body was trembling and my voice was shaking. I was hanging around quite awkwardly without saying anything. 5 p.m. came and I was already late for work, but fortunately my boss knew that I was going to have this conversation today, and they were fine. So I stopped, I took a deep breath and asked my mum and dad if I could talk to them quickly. It instantly felt like the world's eyes and ears were on me. My heart was beating through my chest. I was sweating, trembling more than before. I told them that I needed to tell them something, and the following words came stumbling from my mouth. "I think I'm bisexual." There was a pause. My heart leapt into my throat and my stomach turned upside down. My skin tightened around my body, and it felt like hours, but in reality it was seconds. My parents' reaction was unexpected. They were relieved. My mum told me that they knew something had been going on, but they thought that I was going to tell them that I'd got someone pregnant. I nervously laughed and explained that I'd known this about myself for a long time, but even at that point I still didn't feel comfortable telling them that I was gay. My mum's next words broke me, but I stayed strong at the time. She said, "We love you no matter what. Just make sure you're careful and safe." My dad had stayed fairly quiet, nodding and agreeing with my mum, quietly supporting and accepting in his own way. So we hugged and I jumped into the car to go to work. As I left the house, a really strange feeling came over me. It was like I could finally breathe. And I'd done it at 24 years old, after 15 years of hiding who I actually was. I could finally be me. The nerves turned to excitement and emotion with tears starting to stream down my face. I felt enlightened, elated. I felt whole. Nothing had ever made me feel like this before. My life could finally start, and I was starting to find a little bit of pride in myself. I got to work and I looked like a complete mess. My eyes were bloodshot and my voice was still shaking. My boss took me aside and asked me how it went. I think she was kind of worried that it hadn't gone very well, from looking at me. But I told her that it went really well. My parents were absolutely fine, and she hugged me. All of my colleagues at the time hugged me. It was the first time that I'd felt truly accepted in my life. So after my shift, I got home around 1 a.m. My mum was still awake, but they'd never stay awake long enough to see me usually. But this time my mum did. She hugged me as soon as I came in and told me that I can talk to them anytime about anything that I needed to. So there was the me before and then this new me. And this version was more confident, more honest, more open. I was free, I explored the gay world, I made new friends, I visited gay bars, and I was doing everything that I'd wanted to do for years, but I'd never felt comfortable enough to do so. I went to my first Pride in Brighton in 2011, around 6 months after I came out. It was such an amazing experience. You know, there was hundreds of thousands of people from all spectrums of the LGBTQ plus community, all gathered together, celebrating their freedom, their acceptance, and remembering the fight to gain fair and equal treatment. And it was a party, a festival of colour. I remember walking around the city, seeing men holding hands with men, women kissing women. It was something I'd only ever seen, you know, on TV, in the news, or in my head. People were laughing and dancing, just being themselves. This was something that my dreams were made of. And the whole city was accepting and integrating of the LGBTQ plus culture and just completely celebrating diversity. So coming from a small village of no more than sort of 50, 80 people to this, it was like I was on a different planet, a different world. It was so warm, accepting, and so diverse. But the weekend had to end. I went back to the Lake District knowing that there was no life for me there anymore. A really good friend of mine had moved from the Lake District to Brighton a few months before, and I spent Pride with her, and we talked about me wanting to move down. So at home, I started to make my plans to move. I told work, I told family, I told friends. I got a job in Brighton. I arranged a flat share with someone that I'd met on an earlier trip, and everything worked out perfectly. It felt like it was meant to be. So at the start of October 2011, I packed my life into a suitcase and waving goodbye to my parents, jumped onto a train, and I had a one-way ticket to Brighton. Life was great. I was having the best time. I'd met a guy and we got into a relationship quite quickly. Work was going really well. You know, I was making new friends and just having the most amazing time. Things really couldn't have been going any better. But in November, I became unwell. For around a week, I had flu-like symptoms. I felt sick, achy, tired, and I had cold sweats. And I, to be honest, just wrote it off as the flu or a bad cold until at the end of the week, I developed a rash down my arm. And it looked like the rash you get with meningitis. I even did the glass test to see if it would disappear. So I took myself to the doctor and they checked up and rushed me straight into hospital. And I stayed there for the afternoon and the evening while tests were being carried out. I was discharged later the night after the doctors found out it wasn't meningitis. The hospital told me that all the test results would be back in like a week or so. And true to their words, around a week later, I received a phone call and a letter asking me to go back to the hospital. And this was to the tropical diseases clinic of all places. And by that point, I was feeling much better. The rash had cleared up, all my symptoms had gone. I was back at work and I was back enjoying life again. And the appointment came, so I made my way to the hospital. Again, still happy, excited, and loving life. I got there and waited before being called into like a small, kind of musty smelling room, and it had a single small frosted window. There was a doctor and a student doctor in the room with my consent. After speaking through the symptoms and what had happened, the doctor explained that when I was admitted to hospital, they'd carried out some blood tests. And he asked me this question. He asked me if I'd ever been tested for HIV before. I hadn't. To be honest with you, I knew very little about it, other than thinking it was a death sentence. And I remembered being shown the Tombstone TV advert when I was in school. And for those of you who don't know, this advert was shown on TV in the 80s, and it showed a large tombstone with the word AIDS being chiseled into it. And there was this booming voiceover saying, "AIDS, don't die of ignorance." I'd never thought about being tested for HIV, and in all honesty, I wouldn't have even known where or how to get tested. As my heart started to race, the doctor continued and explained that as part of the tests they ran, HIV was one of them, and the result had come back positive. Instantly, the world stopped moving. The room felt dark and claustrophobic, and it felt like my heart stopped beating. Everything came crashing down around me, and I saw my life coming to an end. All of the fun and excitement of coming out, of moving to Brighton, enjoying my new life and freedom just disappeared in that split second. I sat there in shock, in silence, my head in complete chaos. The doctor was still talking, but I couldn't hear anything that he was saying. His lips were moving, but there was no sounds coming out. The only thing that I could hear was me telling myself that I was going to die and that was it. My life was over. Gradually, the tears flooded my face, and I thought back to those memories of driving to work after coming out to my parents, and now they're replaced with devastation, sadness, and confusion. I stayed quiet for the rest of the consultation, and I wasn't really taking in much of what the doctor was telling me. But eventually, realising the seriousness of the situation, I started to tune back in. Soon after that, I was met by the hospital's HIV liaison officer, who took me to the specialised HIV unit across the road. And tears kind of turned to embarrassment. As I was taken from A&E across to the Lawson unit, I caught a glimpse of myself in a mirror and I looked dreadful. The liaison officer was fantastic. He talked me through what the diagnosis meant, what the treatment options were, and all of the support that was available to me. He was extremely calm, compassionate, and empathetic. He metaphorically took my hand and guided me through this whole thing. Meanwhile, my head was still chaotic. I was still seeing my life end and still seeing the world crash around me. After around an hour or so, I was released back into the world. My head was heavy, and that weight, which had been lifted from my shoulders when I came out, was back again, only this time it felt much heavier. I found a quiet side street next to the hospital, and I hid away. Devastated and distraught, I then called my boyfriend at the time to tell him the news. He was on his way back to London. So I told him that I was diagnosed as being HIV positive. Saying it out loud for that first time just broke me, and he made his way back to Brighton that same evening. I then called a really good friend of mine, and this is a friend who moved to Brighton shortly before I did. I asked if we could meet. She knew right then that something was wrong, but I think anyone speaking to me at that time would have known that something wasn't right. So we met and I told her the news. Again, saying the words "I'm HIV positive" broke every ounce of my being, and eventually we headed to a pub. Thinking back, maybe that wasn't the best of ideas, but somehow we managed to laugh and have a good time. But in the back of my mind, the diagnosis was crushing me. And the following weeks and months were terrifying. I was a shadow of my former self. My spirit was crushed. I'd started to speak to close friends and tell them what had happened. I was signed off work for around a month, and I eventually went back and explained to work what had happened. I was under no pressure to tell work, but I felt for me it was the right thing to do. I was really struggling with my mental health. Suicide was right at the very forefront of my mind, and I once found myself sitting on Brighton Beach, again in floods of tears, staring into the sea, imagining my lifeless body floating around beneath the waves. A lady walking on the beach stopped and asked me if everything was okay. I said yes, and that I was fine, even though I was far from that. But that simple act of care and kindness stopped me from going through with anything, and I made my way back home. But I was in this place once again where there was two more people I had to tell, my parents. How could I put them through this after having come out just a few months ago and then left them to move to Brighton? How could I do this to them? And how could I do this after the words "be careful" and "safe" came from my mum's mouth? But I had to, and I wanted to do it. The journey home was horrible. I think I was more nervous then than I was on the day that I'd come out. I just remember sitting on the train, staring out of the window into space, just wondering what their reaction would be. It felt like the longest journey ever. And when it came to an end, my parents were at the train station waiting for me. I slowly walked over to them, putting a fake smile on my face, but they could see right through it. My mum came in to hug me, but instead of putting my arms around her and reciprocating like I had done when I'd come out, I pushed her away. I was scared that somehow she'd get HIV from me, and to this day, thinking about it and saying this out loud breaks my heart. But in the end, I didn't actually need to tell them that I was HIV positive. My mum's intuition had picked up on this from the phone calls we'd had about my illness, about the hospital appointments, and then about me going up to see them. I spent a lot of the next year or so reading, researching, speaking to my doctor and a friend of mine who was HIV positive. And in time, I eventually started to understand the prognosis, and I came to terms with my diagnosis. And the truth is that HIV isn't a death sentence. In 2014, around 3 years after my diagnosis, I started taking antiretroviral treatment. The medication reduces HIV to an undetectable level in the blood, and at this level, HIV can't be passed on. The term U equals U, which means undetectable equals untransmittable, is used for people who are HIV positive and on successful treatment. So thanks to the medication, my lifespan is now comparable to those who don't have HIV. The only real changes to my life is I now take 1 pill per day, and I have blood tests every 6 months and see a doctor every year. But the worst part about living with HIV is the stigma and the miseducation surrounding it. It's far too common for people to believe that you can transmit HIV by kissing, by touching, by sharing food and drink. You can't. The only way you can pass on HIV is through blood, other bodily fluids, and from mother to baby or through breast milk. And this is only ever possible when the HIV positive individual has a detectable viral load. Back in December, I posted a video on Facebook and YouTube talking about my diagnosis, and I kind of started speaking out a bit more about, how normal living with HIV actually is. And the stigma is just so much more virulent and damaging than the virus itself. And only by talking about it, by educating ourselves and keeping an open mind, can we work to deconstruct this stigma and rebuild with the knowledge that HIV isn't deadly or isn't life-destroying when it's controlled. And if you find yourself potentially at risk of contracting HIV, then there's a few simple steps you can take. The most obvious is using condoms. And there's two kind of fairly new treatments which can help before or after potential exposure. PrEP, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis, is designed to be taken before you might get exposed to HIV. And then there's also PEP, which stands for post-exposure prophylaxis. And this can be taken after exposure to stop HIV from taking hold within the body. For me, owning, sharing, and being open with my story has really helped me to further come to terms with and to understand my diagnosis and to become more at peace with it. If you're unaware of your HIV status or are concerned, I really do suggest getting tested. That's the only way to know your status. Education is key, not just to ending new HIV transmissions, but also tackling the stigma associated with it. Pride is hugely important for me. I remember what it was like to feel uncomfortable with my own identity and sexuality, and to spend years fighting against it and hiding myself. But now I'm able to celebrate. I feel included and accepted. But it hasn't always been plain sailing here in the UK. I've had words like faggot, puff, and bender yelled at me from across the street on many occasions. People still face discrimination and get beaten up, even killed for being LGBTQ+, in countries like the UK, the US, and others, than countries which are more accepting. But Pride is remembering the Stonewall Uprising, the mistreatment by the police, and the story of Marsha P. Johnson marching the first gay pride rally in New York in 1970. And it's miners marching alongside queer people in the London Pride Parade in 1985. It's remembering Section 28, which was a law in the UK that banned the promotion of homosexual material in schools. And it's the recent kidnapping and beheading of an Iranian man after his family found out that he was gay. Pride is remembering the 49 beautiful souls brutally murdered in the Pulse nightclub attack 5 years ago in Orlando. It's an opportunity to celebrate our differences, but it's also remembering that people from the LGBT community around the world do not have the same rights and do not get the same treatment as others. LGBTQ plus people in some countries still face discrimination, persecution, and even death just for being themselves. Pride is seeing the faces of the 29 trans and gender non-conforming people killed in the US so far this year. But it's also about hope, unity, and strength. And it's the hope that things will keep getting better. It's uniting together to protect our fellow human beings and standing strong in the face of discrimination. Pride is just as important now as it's ever been. Here in the UK, the government recently disbanded the LGBT advisory panel after some of its members resigned over the delay in banning conversion therapy. And on the 31st of May, just one day before the start of Pride Month, the UK government announced its intentions to leave Stonewall's Diversity Champions programme without any kind of replacement. Earlier this year, the government also announced their plans to reduce the contribution to the UNAIDS organisation by 80%. That's a huge amount of money. UNAIDS works across the world to support an expanded response to HIV and AIDS, and they kind of set the new goal to end HIV transmissions by 2030. Just a couple of months ago, Hungary announced a new law which banned gay people from featuring in school educational material or TV shows for under 18s, and this is just like a modern day Section 28. Around the world, 72 countries still criminalise same-sex relationships, with 45 of these applying the law to women as well as men. And the death penalty for homosexuality still exists in 8 countries. We all need to stand up for LGBTQ plus community around the world. And if you know someone that's struggling with their sexuality or their gender identity, be there to support them through it. And Pride isn't just for those of us who are out, it's also for those who can't, aren't ready to share their sexuality or gender identity, or it's for those who aren't sure what it is yet. We need to support and celebrate those people just as much as the rest of the community. The experiences and thoughts I've talked about today are just my perspective of coming out, of being diagnosed with HIV. Not everyone has the same experience as I did, but if just one person takes something away from this video which can help themselves or help them in support other members of the community or family, and then that's all I could ever ask for. On a day-to-day basis, we can all support our LGBTQ+ community by standing up against and calling out discrimination. Thank you all so much for listening.